Big question. Not that there's anything wrong with big questions. I'm all about the big questions. And I ask, what is your own analysis on how you should approach or solve this problem? And you say, never see any of them again, work really hard to process and heal. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to unpack this to the best of my ability as a life coach, specializing in these issues, with a personal history and background to this issue specifically. So because I've personally done so much healing and recovery work in my own life around this issue, I can speak to it from personal experience. But I will say, before I do that, anyone who has a history of childhood sexual abuse needs time with a trauma-informed clinician, an actual psychotherapist. And not all psychotherapists are created equal, that is for sure. Many of you will say, well, you know, I've seen many psychotherapists and none of them knew how to help me, and I know I've had that experience also, and I've also worked with some amazing psychotherapists. So they're not all created equal. With regards to these issues, specifically the one that I worked with back in the day, what would now be about 15 years ago, had a very strong background having to do with childhood sexual abuse. So she was very skilled, experienced, highly trained, and just a tremendous fit for me in a number of ways, right? So, and I can tell you that when I was dealing with this stuff in my own life, I had that therapist that I just mentioned. I had a sponsor. My sponsor had a sponsor with 30 plus years of recovery under her belt and experience with these issues. She worked as a professional in a treatment center for many, many years, where she was supporting people in healing and recovery from the effects of family dysfunction. This would be one of the more high voltage experiences that we can have in our families, certainly. So she had some experience there. The point I'm trying to get to is I was very well surrounded. My support system was rock solid, and I understood that it was my job and responsibility to support myself through this part of my healing and recovery journey, which without question was like open heart surgery without the anesthetic, right? I had a tumor in my heart by virtue of this sick secret that I had been handed as a young child, right? That I had no idea the extent to which it had kept me sick until I actually went through the process of healing from all of that. So, sorry, I have something in my eye here. So first and foremost, I just want to encourage anyone who has this history to seek out specialized support. You can make tremendous gains in your healing and recovery journey from codependency, narcissistic abuse, and adult child syndrome. And certainly sexual abuse falls under the umbrella of narcissistic abuse, without question. And we're going to get to, you know, why I say that in a moment. But there's a limit to what a digital program like this can do with regards to that depth of trauma, right? So this is a particular lane that will serve you well. The more you put into the work, the better off you will be. But sometimes we need more. And this would be an area where I would say definitely you want to make a point of giving yourself more. Even if it means you have to spend the next 6 to 12 months seeking out the right therapist who is a good fit and a good match and has the experience to support you in this kind of trauma recovery. You do what you need to do to take care of you and to support yourself and to get the help that you need. Okay, so first and foremost, I want to say that. Now, in terms of understanding the epidemiology, I'm honestly, you know, not aware of any specific research. I mean, I'm sure the research has been done somewhere to some degree, but it's not something that I can speak to. I'm not aware of any specific research relating to this combination. What I will say is this. I'm going to point out the obvious, which isn't necessarily so obvious for a lot of people, especially when you're new to healing and recovery from these issues. I believe it goes without saying that anyone who can perpetrate on a child of any age in this fashion. Clearly, we are dealing with someone who, at the very least, has empathy impairment, if not lacking in conscience entirely, who feels entitled, who has an overinflated. In order to exploit a child in this fashion, you must be empathy impaired to a large degree, if not entirely, lacking in conscience to a large degree, if not entirely. And what I mean by that is, remember, the destructive narcissist personality pattern is a spectrum, it's a continuum, right? So there are varying degrees and various manifestations. At the high end of the spectrum, we have people who are lacking in conscience entirely, who, if they sat in front of the right doctor of psychiatry, would undoubtedly have a diagnosis. Many of them go undiagnosed, running around our planet undiagnosed, right? It's not everyone with a personality disorder who has been diagnosed. But at this end of the spectrum, we're talking about personality disordered, antisocial personality disorder, lacking in conscience entirely. Whether they've been diagnosed or undiagnosed is not the issue. But remember, there's a spectrum here, right? So anyone who feels entitled to perpetrate on and exploit a child of any age in that fashion for their own sexual gratification is, at the very least, empathy impaired, if not lacking in conscience entirely, and carrying an insane level of entitlement. I mean, purely, like, insane is the accurate word. Like, you have to be pretty delusional in terms of your sense of entitlement to perpetrate on a child in that fashion, not to mention selfish and self-centered, self-absorbed in the extreme, right? So if that's the case, in my view, anyone who is a pedophile, has perpetrated on a child or children in that fashion, whether it be through, you know, we're all adults here, so I'm just going to speak plainly because it's easier, okay? No filter, it's easier. If it's a really squeamish conversation for folks, you can opt out for 5-10 minutes, come back in, and, you know, we'll move on to other subjects. I know that this isn't, you know, a comfortable conversation for everyone, but it needs to be had, right? It falls under the umbrella of narcissistic abuse, so it's worth having, not least of which the question has been posed. So anyone who feels entitled to harm a child in this fashion, exploit a child in this fashion, perpetrate upon a child in this fashion, whether that be a function of, you know, molestation, titillation, right? So there's a spectrum, right? Or like the more severe, horrific forms of the kind of things that go on. We know what those are, right? Like horrific things that are done to children, or anywhere in between. We are talking about someone who, at the very least, has a destructive narcissist personality pattern by virtue of the fact that they are capable of this kind of act, no matter where it, you know, whether it's obviously the more severe. If you are capable of raping and sodomizing a child, you are clearly antisocial personality disordered. I don't think we need a doctor of psychiatry to tell us that, right? Clearly, you're a monster if you can do that. Or you're just again, I'm just going to speak no filter. Let's just call it what it is. You're a real sick fuck who needs help. And you have this sick compulsion to gratify yourself via molesting children, or again, anywhere in between. No matter where we're talking, you know, on this spectrum of the act, we are talking about people who, at the very least, have a destructive narcissist personality pattern, and I would say not even moderately so. You have to be pretty freaking empathy impaired to feel entitled to harm a child, exploit a child, manipulate a child. So, you know, my own experiences in this realm as a child were not over here, right? They were more in this direction, but that doesn't mean that the harm was not done. The emotional, psychological, spiritual damage done to a child who is manipulated into secrecy. We have this little secret. And you can't tell anyone because, you know, there's going to be consequences if you tell anyone, right? What that does to a child, barring, you know, these kind of experiences, right? When we're here on the spectrum, the emotional, psychological, and spiritual damage done to a child who's manipulated, handed this toxic, disgusting, dirty little secret, the shame, the guilt, all that's involved in terms of the manipulation, what that does to a child and how that affects us as we move into adult life from an untreated codependency, untreated adult-child syndrome perspective, it is no small thing. It is no small thing. So, point being, we don't have to question whether or not we're dealing with pretty high spectrum destructive narcissists when we're talking about this subject. So I'm wanting to understand childhood sexual abuse in the context of a narcissistic family. So again, it goes without saying, in my view, that we are talking about narcissists when they have this capacity. Denial and outrage are her go-tos, blame and anger day to day. So, you know, then there's the enablers, right? I'm interested to understand the epidemiology of this combination. Is it more likely in families with NPD? Are there any unique dynamics that evolve as a result? So I think I've answered the question in terms of whether or not it's more likely. I'm not going to say that everyone out there with a destructive narcissist personality pattern is a pedophile. But I would say that every pedophile is high on the spectrum of destructive narcissist personality pattern. And the more serious their crimes against children, the more antisocial personality disorder they would have to be. They would have to be. So it's like not every sociopath is a serial killer, but every serial killer is a sociopath. So let me say that again. Not every sociopath is a serial killer. There are lots of sociopaths out there in government, in corporate, in all walks of life, who aren't serial killers. But in order to be a serial killer, you would have to be sociopathic. And I feel that the same applies in terms of pedophilia. Not all destructive narcissists are going to be pedophiles, but guaranteed if you're a pedophile, you are high on that spectrum. So, you know, I grew up in a very narcissistic family, and not every narcissist in that family was a pedophile or even had those kind of inclinations whatsoever. So it's not because you grew up in a narcissistic family that there's necessarily going to be childhood sexual abuse. But if you experienced it within your family of origin, you definitely came from a narcissistic family, if that makes sense. And, you know, I'm going to deduce by this questions that your mother, as you're describing her, at the very least, very codependent, possibly covert narcissist. You have to be pretty empathy impaired to know that that's going on in your home, not least of which with your children, but any child, and to turn a blind eye and to not intervene and to not do whatever you need to do to get yourself and those children out of that environment, or the pedophile out of the environment. And this, unfortunately, is all too common, right? Like I can, you know, I don't know how many stories I am aware of with clients and personal friends where, you know, one parent was perpetrating, or one uncle or aunt was perpetrating, and the other adult in the close dynamic was turning a blind eye. You know, the father who creeps down the hall and enters, you know, the child's room at, you know, hours that don't make sense, and the mother who, you know, just rolls over and allows that to continue to happen without any question, right? You have to be pretty freaking empathy impaired to roll over and just allow that to continue to happen. So if, and I don't know all the details here, but if I'm piecing this together accurately and your mother was an enabler, she's complicit. And she for sure is on the spectrum of destructive narcissist personality pattern. Where she is on that spectrum, I don't know. Run the quiz in your back office, top right-hand corner. You have the quiz based on your personal experience, 30 questions that you answered will tell you how high spectrum she is. And covert narcissists are tricky because they're very, you know, they present so demure and soft-spoken, and, you know, like they're just the most wonderful human beings, right? When there's a whole other reality going on. So I think, you know, that's the bottom line there is, in order for any of this to be taking place whatsoever, you are absolutely dealing with people who have a destructive narcissist personality pattern. Now, with regards to what is your own analysis on how you should approach or solve this problem, never see any of them again, work really hard to process and heal. Yeah. And when it comes to this stuff, you know, again, I'm going to strongly encourage you to seek professional help, even if you have to spend some time seeking, you know, before you find the right fit for yourself. Give yourself the gift. These are big issues to be grappling with on our own. I had a village around me when I was dealing with this. You know, in my case, what happened was my cousins, who were like siblings to me, had, you know, their brother and sister. They'd both gotten married within a year. They were, you know, the one cousin whose wife was having a baby. 6 months later, the other cousin, she was having a baby. So within 6 months, they were both having babies. And that day that I had always known would come had finally arrived. For 33 years, I had been silent. And, you know, from the time that I was 7, and then the year that I was 40, my cousins were having their first children, and I knew that that day had finally arrived where I had no choice but to step up and speak the truth, come what may. Because if anything happened to those kids, it wasn't going to be because I kept my mouth shut. And I knew as their grandfather, he would have unfettered access to them. And this uncle in particular is the most upstanding, highly respected, successful, it all looks good on the outside, right? Which is not always, but often the case, right? The last person anybody would suspect in our extended family to have done this, the last person. And of course, there was all kinds of, you know, guilt and shame in terms of my own complicity, in the sense that I didn't say anything at the age of 7 when this started and went on for a number of years. You know, all those years as a teen and in my 20s, when I didn't say anything because I had been cast as a family scapegoat, and I knew full well that nobody was going to believe me over him. And when I was 40, the time came where it was time to speak the truth, to take care of the next generation of children, whether anybody believed me or not. Like I said, if anything happened to those kids, it wasn't going to be because I kept my mouth shut. And sure enough, what I always knew would happen is what happened. My cousins, I wrote letters because that was the only way that I'd have an opportunity to be properly heard. And they never spoke to me again. That was 2009. It's 14 years later. They never spoke to me again. And, you know, the counselor I was working with at the time said it's a whole lot easier to believe that your cousin's a lying whack job, even though they had, for them, 35 plus years of experience with me and knew who I was as a human being. Nonetheless, it's a whole lot easier to believe your cousin's a lying whack job than it is to believe that your father is a pedophile. So, okay. Enabled further by the fact that my aunt was a lying, narcissistic, enabling you know, fully had influence and control over how that, you know, all went, in terms of protecting their image and all of it, right? So the level of scapegoating involved in these issues is next level. So that, you know, the reason I share that aspect with you is because we really need to be well supported when these are the kind of things that we're dealing with. Had I not had the team of healthy, recovering, smart, experienced people that I had around me supporting me, I'm not sure I would have survived. And I'm one strong freaking cookie, let me tell you. But the open heart surgery without the anesthetic, the laying in a fetal position for 6 months before and after, preparing to out him, and then waiting for the phone calls to come that never came. And the years-long grieving process, because fully 8 people that I loved dearly died for me in one foul swoop when all of that went down. So we need support, and the right kind of support when we're dealing with these issues. Do not underestimate that. Do I think that we are better off never seeing them again? I can tell you that this particular aunt and uncle would never have access to me again. And given that my cousins didn't so much as give me the benefit of a conversation, I didn't even deserve the benefit of a conversation. Maybe they were afraid. You know, the truth has a frequency all of its own, right? So maybe they were afraid to go there, but even their spouses didn't give me the benefit of a conversation given the nature of, right, the information. I'm not sure that they'd ever get back in either if they ever came knocking. That'll be a decision that I would make in the moment when the time comes. If I'm ever faced with that decision, I'll make that decision then. The point I'm getting at is when people feel entitled to harm us in any way, but in particular as gravely as what we're discussing, and have no remorse, absolutely, they should never, ever have access to you again, no matter who they are. In my opinion, in my view, based on my experience, no matter who they are. So I hope that helps. It's a big one and far more common than people realize. Far more common than people realize. You know, sick stuff. So let me know if there's any other questions that came out of that. I hope I unpacked that adequately for you. I've got someone saying here, my dad was a pedophile and I believe a psychopath due to his grins when he would frighten us for his kicks. Yeah. Yeah. There are some sick people on this planet, there's no question.